The dust on the horizon wasn't just the wind this time. It carried a scent that was deeply, achingly familiar, a ghost from her past made impossibly, terribly real. Alara shaded her eyes against the sinking African sun, the vast expanse of savanna shimmering in the day's dying heat. It had been 5 long years, a span that felt like another lifetime, since she had last seen him, since her heart had fractured as he walked away into the acacia scrub, a juvenile lion finally answering the irresistible summons of the wild. Now, the wild was calling at her doorstep, not with a whisper, but with the earth-trembling presence of a full pride. Before we dive into Alara's extraordinary story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you believe kindness exists in the wild, and that bonds can transcend the boundaries of species. Hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of courage and connection. The figures resolved themselves slowly out of the haze. First one, then two, then more. Lionesses, sleek and powerful, moved with a liquid grace, their tawny coats blending with the parched grasses. And leading them, a magnificent male, his mane a dark corona around a battle-scarred face, his shoulders rolling with an authority that brooked no argument. He was larger than the memory she cherished, broader, imbued with a raw power that sent a shiver down her spine that was equal parts terror and an impossible, burgeoning hope. This was no solitary, returning creature. This was a king with his court, a potentially lethal force at the edge of her isolated homestead. Her hand instinctively went to the old wooden porch railing, gripping it until her knuckles were white. He was not alone. And something was about to shift in that silence, a silence already thrumming with unspoken tension. Her mind, however, refused the immediate, overwhelming present, hurtling back through the seasons, back to a tiny, desperate sound that had changed everything. 5 years prior, Alara lived a life carved from the solitude of the African bush. Her small, sturdy cottage, little more than a research outpost she'd inherited and clung to, stood on a slight rise overlooking a vast, unfenced conservancy. She was a woman who had learned the language of the wind and the rhythm of the rains, her days measured by the movements of game and the subtle shifts in the landscape. She wasn't a recluse by misanthropy, but by a profound, almost reverent kinship with the wild that most found unnerving. She'd once been a biologist, tracking migratory patterns, but funding had dried up, and she'd stayed, unable to sever the deep roots she'd grown in this unforgiving, beautiful land. Her skin was weathered by the sun, her eyes held the quiet, watchful intensity of someone who spent more time observing than speaking. The dry season had been particularly brutal that year. The rivers had shrunk to muddy trickles, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and distant, desperate thirst. It was on one of her long walks, checking the perimeter for any signs of poaching activity, a grim, self-appointed task, that she heard it. A sound so faint it was almost lost beneath the drone of insects and the rustle of dry leaves, a high-pitched, wavering mewl. Her breath caught. It was the sound of distress, small and utterly vulnerable. Overhead, a pair of tawny eagles circled, their keen eyes fixed on something below. A knot of dread tightened in Alara's chest. Such sounds, in such a place, often heralded tragedy. She moved cautiously, her boots making little sound on the baked earth. The mewling came again, weaker this time, from a dense thicket of thornbush near a dried-up watercourse. Pushing aside the sharp, entangling branches, her heart constricted. There, huddled in the meager shade, was a lion cub. He couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, his blue eyes still clouded with infancy, his spotted coat matted with dirt. He was terrifyingly small, ribs starkly visible beneath his thin fur, and he trembled uncontrollably, whether from cold, hunger, or fear, she couldn't tell. There was no sign of a mother, no tracks nearby save for her own. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of old blood, and a little further off, she saw the disturbed earth and drag marks that told a grim story, likely a lioness fallen victim to a territorial dispute, or perhaps poachers. The circling eagles now made a terrible, predatory sense. This tiny creature was alone, an orphan in a world designed for the strong. Alara knelt, her mind racing. Every instinct, every protocol she'd ever learned, screamed non-interference. Nature had its own brutal calculus. But looking at the cub, his tiny body racked with shivers, his faint cries tearing at something deep within her, the rules felt distant and abstract. He was so close to death, too young to have any chance. To leave him was a death sentence, swift and certain. The ethical dilemma warred with a surge of raw, unbidden compassion. She thought of the hyenas whose calls often punctuated the night, the jackals that would soon be scavenging. He was defenseless, With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire savannah, she made her decision. She couldn't just walk away. Carefully, she extended a hand. The cub flinched, letting out a tiny, surprisingly fierce hiss, a spark of the king he was meant to be. "It's okay, little one," she murmured, her voice soft, crooning. "I'm not going to hurt you." She scooped him up. He was shockingly light, a fragile bundle of bones and fur. He was too weak to struggle much. Holding him against her chest, feeling the faint, rapid beat of his heart against her own, she turned and began the slow walk back to her cottage, the weight of her transgression against the wild's harsh laws settling upon her, yet overshadowed by the urgent need to save this one small life. The first challenge was simply getting him there. He seemed to fade in her arms, his breathing shallow. Once inside, she laid him on an old blanket near the coolness of the stone hearth. His eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow. Panic nipped at her. What had she done? Could she even help him? Her fumbling attempts to get him to take a little warm water from a syringe were met with weak resistance, then a pathetic lap. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days that followed blurred into a cycle of desperate care. Alara named him Aslan, a touch of whimsy from a childhood story, a name that felt both hopeful and impossibly grand for the tiny creature fighting for his life. She consulted old veterinary manuals by the light of a kerosene lamp, researched formulas for abandoned kittens, adapting them, praying she was getting it right. The first few nights were touch and go. Aslan developed a fever, his small body hot and listless. Alara barely slept, coaxing droplets of rehydration fluid between his lips, wiping his face with a cool, damp cloth, her quiet murmurs a constant presence in the small room. She felt a profound, terrifying responsibility. There were moments she was sure she would lose him, moments his breathing became so faint she had to press her ear to his chest to detect it. The distant roars of wild lions at night sounded like accusations, reminders of the world to which he belonged, a world she had stolen him from, however good her intentions. Slowly, miraculously, Aslan began to rally. The fever broke. His suckling reflex grew stronger, and he started to take the makeshift milk formula with more enthusiasm, his tiny paws kneading her arm as he fed. His blue eyes cleared, focusing on her face with an unnerving intelligence. A small, rough tongue would rasp against her fingers. The cottage, once a bastion of solitude, was now filled with the small sounds of his existence, the soft patter of his paws as he gained strength, his tiny, rumbling purrs that vibrated through her when she held him, his playful, clumsy pounces on a rolled-up sock. Alara found herself smiling more than she had in years. A quiet joy began to bloom in the desolate spaces of her heart. Raising a lion cub, however, was a far cry from raising a domestic kitten. As Aslan grew, so did his wild instincts. Her small garden became his training ground. He'd stalk butterflies with comical seriousness, his tail twitching, his body low to the ground, before erupting in an awkward, fluffy pounce that usually ended with him tumbling over his own paws. Alara watched these displays with a mixture of amusement and a growing unease. She knew she couldn't keep him forever. Every playful bat of his paw, every strengthening muscle, was a step closer to the inevitable parting. She made a conscious effort not to domesticate him entirely, taking him on supervised forays into the bush just beyond her cottage, letting him smell the wild scents, feel the unfamiliar textures under his paws, always keeping a vigilant watch for danger. Snakes, scorpions, or larger predators that might wander too close. He learned to trust her implicitly. She was his protector, his provider, the center of his small world. He would greet her with rubbing curves against her legs, a deep purr vibrating in his chest. He'd nap at her feet as she worked at her desk, a warm, breathing weight that was both comforting and a constant reminder of his wild heritage. The challenges were immense. Keeping his existence a secret was paramount. If official channels found out, he'd be taken, possibly to a zoo, or worse, deemed unreleasable. So she lived a double life, her solitary existence now harboring an extraordinary secret. Her supplies were carefully managed to avoid suspicion, her trips to the distant trading post infrequent and planned. The months turned into a year, then two. Aslan was no longer a cub but a gangly adolescent, his paws disproportionately large, his mane beginning to show as a faint ruff around his neck. His playful swats now carried considerable force, his teeth, though still gentle with her, were formidable. He'd practice his pounces on an old tire swing she'd hung from a sturdy acacia, tearing at it with a growing ferocity that was both impressive and sobering. He learned to hunt small lizards and rodents that ventured too close to the cottage, his instincts sharpening daily. Alara would watch him, a lump in her throat. He was magnificent, a creature of breathtaking power and grace, and he was outgrowing her small world with every passing day. She began to notice a change in him. He would spend hours gazing out at the savannah, his ears pricked, his body tense, listening to sounds she couldn't hear. A distant roar from a wild pride would make him lift his head, a low rumble starting deep in his own chest, a sound of longing, of nascent belonging. One evening, a large male lion passed relatively close to her property, his powerful scent carried on the breeze. Aslan, who had been dozing on the porch, shot to his feet, every muscle quivering. He didn't roar back, not yet, but he paced restlessly, his eyes fixed on the horizon long after the scent had faded. Alara saw it then, with painful clarity. The wild was calling him, and it was a call she could not, and should not, deny. The thought of him facing that world alone, without a pride, without the skills honed by a natural upbringing, terrified her. But the thought of keeping him, of condemning him to a half-life at her side, was even more unbearable. Her heart ached with a premonition of loss, a deep, visceral grief for a parting that hadn't yet happened but felt as inevitable as the rising sun. She had saved his life, yes, but what kind of life could she ultimately offer him? He was a lion. He belonged to the endless plains, to the starlit nights, to the company of his own kind. The joy of his companionship was now tinged with the sharp sorrow of impending separation. There were days she'd watch him, her vision blurring with unshed tears, memorizing the way the sunlight caught his fur, the intelligence in his golden eyes, the sheer, untamed beauty of him. The time had come. With a heavy heart, she made the call to a reputable lion sanctuary and rehabilitation center several hundred kilometers away, a place known for its success in rewilding captive or orphan lions. It was the first, agonizing step in returning him to a world he barely knew, a world that might not accept him, but a world that was undeniably his. The sanctuary director, a pragmatic but compassionate man named David, listened to her story with a mixture of skepticism and understanding. He explained the immense difficulties, the low chances of successful integration for a lion raised by a human. But Alara's detailed notes on Aslan's behavior, his retained wild instincts, his health, and her willingness to be completely transparent, convinced him to at least assess the situation. The arrival of the sanctuary vehicle a few weeks later was one of the hardest days of Alara's life. Aslan, now nearly full-grown but still with the trusting nature he reserved for her, was curious about the strangers in the large, unfamiliar crate. Luring him in with a piece of fresh meat, a task David insisted Alara perform to minimize stress, felt like a betrayal. The click of the crate door shutting echoed in the sudden, profound silence of her homestead. She pressed her forehead against the metal bars, whispering promises to him, words of love and reassurance, her tears falling onto his fur. He looked back at her, a confused, soft chuff escaping him, his golden eyes questioning. The journey to the sanctuary was a blur of anxiety for Alara, who followed in her own aging Land Rover. The sanctuary was a sprawling expanse of natural bush, securely fenced, where lions could live in semi-wild conditions, relearn hunting skills, and form social bonds. Aslan was initially kept in a large boma, separate but within sight and scent of other lions. Alara was allowed to visit, at a distance, during the initial settling-in period. Seeing him there, pacing, sometimes looking towards her with that familiar, searching gaze, was a fresh torment. But slowly, David's reports became more encouraging. Aslan was strong, intelligent, and wary of the other lions, which was a good sign. He showed interest in the carcasses provided. His hunting instincts, though raw, were present. He began to respond to the calls of the other lions, his own tentative roars joining the nightly chorus. Months passed. Alara's visits became less frequent, guided by David's advice to allow Aslan to detach from her and bond with his own kind. Each visit was a bittersweet pang. He would still recognize her, approach the fence, sometimes rubbing against it where her scent lingered. But his attention was increasingly drawn to the other lions, to the vastness of his enclosure. The sanctuary's plan was to eventually release him into a larger, adjoining private conservancy, a massive tract of wilderness where he could live a truly wild life. The day David called to say Aslan was ready for that final step, Alara felt a complex mix of pride, relief, and an overwhelming sense of desolation. She was there for his release. He was now a magnificent young adult, his mane fuller, his body lean and powerful. He strode out of the transport crate into the vastness of the conservancy without a backward glance. He paused at the edge of a thicket, his head raised, testing the wind, a king surveying his new domain. Then, with a flick of his tail, he melted into the bush. Alara watched until he was gone, tears streaming down her face. It was the right thing, the only thing, but her world felt suddenly, irrevocably empty. The silence of her cottage became a heavy cloak. For 5 years, she grieved his absence, a quiet, constant ache in her soul. She continued her solitary life, her walks, her vigilance, the memory of Aslan a cherished, painful secret. And now this. The lead male of the approaching pride stopped 100 yards from her porch. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the scene in hues of orange and blood red. The lionesses fanned out slightly behind him, watchful, their amber eyes fixed on Alara. Several half-grown cubs tumbled and played amongst their legs, seemingly oblivious to the tension. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was no dream, no heat-induced hallucination. This was real. The male was immense, far larger than Aslan had been when he left. His face was a tapestry of old battles, a testament to the harsh life of a pride male. Could it truly be him? After all this time? Doubt warred with a desperate, illogical certainty. He took another step, then another, his movements fluid and deliberate. Alara stood frozen, not by fear, though that was certainly present, but by a kind of awed disbelief. She recognized the way he held his head, a slight tilt she remembered from his youth. She recognized the peculiar way his left ear had a tiny notch at the top, from a playful tumble into a thorn bush years ago. Her breath hitched. It was him, Aslan. He was a king now, a magnificent, battle-hardened ruler of this wild family. He stopped perhaps 50 yards away, his golden eyes, no longer clouded with cubhood innocence but sharp with a primal wisdom, fixed on her. There was no aggression in his stance, but an intense, unwavering scrutiny. The lionesses growled softly, a low, rumbling threat, but he ignored them, his gaze locked with hers. Alara found her voice, a mere whisper. Aslan. The sound of his name, a name he hadn't heard in 5 years, seemed to hang in the still air. He didn't react in any overtly familiar way. No human-like recognition. He was a wild creature, forged in the crucible of survival. But he didn't charge. He didn't roar a challenge. He simply stood, watching her, a silent, powerful presence. Alara's mind raced. What did he see? A threat? A forgotten figure from a distant past? She remembered a silly little clicking sound she used to make with her tongue when he was a cub, a sound that always made him perk his ears and come bounding over. Almost without thinking, her body acting on a memory too deep for conscious thought, she made the sound, soft and tentative. The great head lifted slightly. His ears twitched, not in alarm, but in something else. A flicker in those golden depths. He let out a soft chuff, a sound that was not a growl, not a roar, but something more akin to a puff of breath, a sound she remembered so vividly from his youth when he was content or curious. It was an exhalation, almost a sigh. It was enough. The terror that had coiled in Alara's stomach began to unspool, replaced by an emotion so overwhelming it brought fresh tears to her eyes. He remembered. In some deep, primal way, he remembered. He turned his massive head slightly towards the lionesses, another soft chuff. It was clearly a signal. The low growling subsided. They remained wary, but the immediate threat seemed to dissipate, their posture relaxing almost imperceptibly as they took their cue from their leader. Aslan then did something that shattered the last of Alara's disbelief. He slowly, deliberately, lowered himself to the ground, not in a crouch of attack, but in a gesture of rest, his front paws tucked beneath him, his gaze still on her, calm and unwavering. One by one, the lionesses followed suit, sinking into the grass, the cubs resuming their play, though more subdued now. The danger had passed, transformed into a moment of profound, impossible connection. Alara sank onto the top step of her porch, her legs suddenly weak. Tears streamed freely now, tears of shock, of relief, of a joy so profound it was almost painful. The pride was there, before her, a wild, majestic family, and its king, the cub she had saved, was acknowledging her presence not as a threat, but as something else. Something known. They stayed for hours, a silent vigil as the stars emerged, brilliant and cold in the African sky. Alara didn't move, scarcely breathed, etching every detail of the scene into her memory. Aslan watched her, his eyes occasionally blinking slowly, a sign of leonine contentment. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in soft pastels, Aslan rose. He stretched, a magnificent arch of his powerful body, and let out a soft, rumbling call, not the full-throated roar of territorial declaration, but a gentle summons. The lionesses and cubs stirred, rising to join him. He gave Alara one last, long look, a look that seemed to span the years, to acknowledge the bond that had once tied them, a bond that, impossibly, still resonated. Then, he turned, and with his pride following, melted back into the savannah from whence they came. Alara watched them go, her heart full. Her life, once defined by solitude and the quiet ache of Aslan's absence, had been irrevocably changed. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for 5 years had lifted, replaced by a sense of wonder, a profound connection to the wild heart of Africa. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was not just a fleeting visit. Over the next few months, the pride's tracks would occasionally appear near her homestead. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, she would hear his roar, no longer a sound of distant wilderness, but a familiar voice, a reassurance. She didn't seek him out, never tried to approach. Their bond was one of silent understanding, a respect for the boundaries between their worlds, bridged by an extraordinary shared past. Her small act of kindness, born of desperation and compassion so many years ago, had returned to her 100-fold, not in a tamed creature, but in the awe-inspiring presence of a wild king and his family, a wild blessing that echoed in the lion's distant, sovereign roar. And as the sun dipped below the acacia thorns that evening, painting the sky in fire, Alara knew her life was forever enriched, interwoven with the rhythm of his pride, a silent guardian watching from afar, her heart finally, unexpectedly, whole.